December 22nd, 1944, 11:30 in the morning, Bastogne, Belgium. The frozen breath of four German officers rose like spirits into gray winter air as they approached the American lines under a white flag. Their polished boots crunched through fresh snow, each step measured and deliberate, each footfall carrying the weight of certainty. Behind them, 30,000 German troops encircled the town, their tanks forming an iron noose around 18,000 trapped Americans. The German officers carried an ultimatum wrapped in the language of mercy, but their eyes betrayed something else, contempt mixed with pity. They had heard the stories. American soldiers, soft and spoiled, who refused to fight without their creature comfort. Americans who would not march without their coffee, who crumbled when supply lines broke, who had never truly known hardship. The German commander's message was clear: surrender now or face total annihilation. What these officers could not know, as they stood in that snow-swept field awaiting reply, was that they were about to witness the collision of propaganda and reality, a moment that would shatter every assumption about the American soldier and transform German perceptions of their enemy forever. The mythology of American weakness had deep roots in German military culture. Throughout 1944, as Allied forces pushed across France, German propaganda had painted a portrait of the American fighting man as fundamentally inferior, a product of decadent democracy, unable to endure true sacrifice. Wehrmacht intelligence reports circulated stories of American units that refused to advance without hot meals, that demanded regular resupply of luxury, that fought only when conditions were favorable. Coffee became the symbol of this alleged softness. German soldiers were told that Americans were so addicted to their morning brew that entire offensives would stall if the coffee supply faltered. It was a comforting narrative for an army watching its empire crumble, a way to explain away defeats by blaming American material superiority rather than American fighting spirit. Officers assured their men that when pushed to true extremity, when stripped of their abundance and surrounded, the Americans would fold. Bastogne would prove this theory. Or so they believed. The town itself seemed an unlikely stage for such a reckoning. Bastogne sat on a plateau in the Ardennes, a market town of 4,000 civilians whose greatest claim to significance was geography. 7 roads radiated from its center, like spokes from a wheel, making it the vital hub for any army trying to move through the region. When Hitler conceived Operation Walk am Rhine, his desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp, Bastogne became the linchpin of the entire offensive. Control those roads, and German panzers could race to the Meuse River unimpeded. Lose Bastogne, and the entire thrust would bog down in the Ardennes forest. The German High Command assembled a force of over 400,000 men for the attack, achieving complete surprise when they struck on December 16, 1944. American units along the front, thinly spread and expecting a quiet sector, reeled backward in confusion as 3 German armies crashed through the snow-covered forests. Within 48 hours, German tanks had penetrated 30 miles in the Allied line, creating a bulge in the front that would give the battle its name. Into this chaos rushed the 101st Airborne Division, pulled from rest and recreation at Camp Mormelon in France, and hurled north in a desperate convoy of trucks. The Screaming Eagles had earned their reputation through fire, jumping into Normandy on D-Day, fighting to the hedgerows, parachuting into Holland during Market Garden. But now they arrived in Bastogne depleted under strength and critically short of supplies. Acting Division Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had fewer than 10,000 paratroopers to defend a perimeter 7 miles in diameter. They had no winter uniforms, only the summer gear they had worn in France. Many had been on leave when the alert came, pulled from bars and brothels in Rheims with hangovers and half their equipment. The medical company's surgical teams had been captured when the division hospital was overrun before they could reach Bastogne. The ammunition reserves were dangerously low, and coffee, that symbol of American excess the Germans mocked, was almost gone. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion arrived in Hemerel, a village a mile and a half northwest of Bastogne, on December 19th, after an all-night drive through roads clogged with retreating troops. Lieutenant Colonel John Cooper positioned his guns to support the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment along the western and southern approaches to the town. The artillerymen had not yet unloaded their trucks when Cooper volunteered a battalion to join the 101st, and they moved out within 45 minutes of receiving the order. Now they dug their howitzers into frozen ground, established firing positions, and waited. The temperature dropped below freezing. Fog settled over the battlefield like a shroud, so thick that forward observers could barely see 100 yards. The 463rd set up its command post in a house in Hemmerle, the aid station in a chapel across the street. They strung communication wire between positions, rationed their remaining ammunition, and prepared for what was coming. By December 20th, German forces had cut the last road into Bastogne. The encirclement was complete. Inside the perimeter, American troops took inventory and discovered the grim mathematics of siege warfare. The division supply train, sent back for ammunition on the 19th, had been cut off and scattered. Food stocks were critically low. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted with no surgical capability remaining in the pocket. Artillery battalions counted their remaining shells with growing alarm. The 463rd had perhaps 5 rounds of high-explosive per gun, a handful of armor-piercing rounds obtained during the Italian campaign, and some white phosphorus. Under normal circumstances, an artillery battery might fire that many rounds in a single mission. Now we have to last indefinitely against an enemy force that grew stronger by the hour, and the coffee was gone. Not rationed, not reduced, simply gone. The Americans would face the German onslaught without the one comfort German propaganda had insisted they could not live without. What the Germans expected was capitulation. What they encountered was something else entirely. On December 21st, the 26th Volks Grenadier Division probed the American lines, testing for weakness. They found none. At Marvy, on the southeastern perimeter, the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment attacked the 327th Glider Infantry with tanks and half-tracks. American artillery, firing shells they could barely afford to spare, hammered the German positions until the attack faltered. At Neuf, German infantry tried to push westward toward Bastogne and met withering fire from a 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. The Americans held, but barely. McAuliffe walked the perimeter and saw what his men were becoming, gaunt, hollow-eyed, teeth chattering from cold, fingers so numb they could barely pull triggers. They had dug foxholes in frozen ground that offered little protection from the artillery fire that rained down intermittently. They ate whatever they could scavenge. Some chewed on K-ration crackers that were 3 years old. Others melted snow for drinking water. None complained about the absence of coffee. There was no energy left for complaints. The German demand for surrender arrived on the morning of December 22nd, carried by the 4 officers under their white flags. The ultimatum was typed on 2 sheets of paper, one in English and one in German, composed in a formal language of military courtesy, but carrying an unmistakable threat. The fortune of war is changing, it read. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There's only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The German commander graciously offered 2 hours for consideration. After that, German artillery and heavy anti-aircraft battalions would annihilate the American forces. The message concluded with a flourish of mock concern. All the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore woke McAuliffe to deliver the news. The general, still half asleep in his bag near the communications center, heard that the Germans wanted to surrender. His response was immediate and instinctive. Nuts. It was not a carefully considered diplomatic reply or a calculated psychological operation. It was the exasperated reaction of a tired soldier who had survived 4 days of hell and had no intention of surrendering to an enemy who thought Americans were soft. When Moore went back to brief the staff, he told them what McAuliffe had said. They laughed, the first real laughter in days. When McAuliffe himself saw the German message and was asked what reply should be sent, his staff suggested various formal military responses. The general shook his head. His original response was perfect. Nuts it would be. The typed reply was delivered to the waiting German officers, who were baffled by the American slang. One of the American officers clarified, "It means go to hell." The Germans departed, their certainty visibly shaken. They had expected pleading or negotiation. They had received defiance. The weather remained Bastogne's cruelest enemy. December 23rd dawned gray and bitter, temperatures well below freezing, but for the first time in a week the fog lifted slightly. At midday, the sound of aircraft engines cut through the cold air. 241C, 47 transport planes appeared over Bastogne, flying through German anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies to the surrounded garrison. Colored parachutes blossomed across the sky, red for ammunition, blue for medical supplies, yellow for food, white for miscellaneous cargo. The sight of those parachutes drifting down brought tears to the eyes of men who had believed themselves abandoned. Troopers ran across open ground under German fire to retrieve the bundles. The 463rd Artillery Battalion received canisters of high explosive shells just as some guns had fired their last rounds. Food arrived, not much, not enough, but something, and in some of the bundles, packed by American supply sergeants in England who understood what mattered, were small packets of instant coffee. The battle intensified. On Christmas Eve, German artillery hit an aid station in Bastogne, killing everyone inside. A Belgian nurse named René Lemaire died evacuating wounded soldiers from the burning building. That same night, the 78th Grenadier Regiment attacked Bisri with tanks and self-propelled guns. American artillery, carefully rationing every shell, broke up the assault. The next morning, Christmas Day, 1944, brought the crisis. In the pre-dawn darkness, 18 Mark IV tanks from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, supported by infantry, broke through the thin defensive line of the 327th Glider Infantry northwest of Bastogne and drove straight toward Hemrul. The German column, apparently mistaking the village for Bastogne itself, advanced to within 100 yards of the 463 RD's gun positions before halting. Visibility was near zero. Fresh snow covered the ground. The German tanks and infantry pulled off the road and stopped, waiting for dawn. In the 463rd Command Post, Lieutenant Colonel Cooper received word of the German presence from an outpost guard. The artillerymen could hear the enemy tanks idling just beyond visual range, could smell the diesel exhaust mixing with the frozen air. Cooper faced an agonizing decision. His guns were positioned for indirect fire support, not point-blank tank combat. His men had been awake for days. Ammunition remained critically low, but if he waited too long to engage, the Germans might realize their position and overwhelm the battery. If he fired too soon in the darkness, his guns might miss and reveal their positions. He ordered his men to hold fire, to wait for enough light to guarantee kills. For over an hour, American artillerymen stood at their guns in the freezing darkness, staring into gloom where enemy tanks waited less than a football field away, neither side moving, both sides waiting for dawn. As gray light seeped across the snow-covered fields, the distinctive silhouettes of German tanks became visible. The Mark IVs sat in the open, their long muzzle brakes unmistakable. Cooper gave the order to fire. What followed was not an artillery bombardment in the traditional sense, but something closer to a point-blank execution. The howitzers, to press a fire almost horizontally, began hammering the German column with high explosive and armor-piercing rounds at ranges so short the gun crews could see their shells impact. The German tankers, caught completely by surprise, tried to react. Some tanks attempted to reverse. Others swung their turrets toward the American guns. But at this range, the American artillerymen had every advantage. Within minutes, 8 German tanks were burning hulks, their ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. A 9th tank, its commander wounded by shrapnel, was captured intact when Private First Class Bulge Childress hung his undershirt on the tank's gun barrel and drove it back into American lines. 2 tanks attempted to flee and were destroyed by a rapid deployment force from division headquarters. Of the 18 tanks that began the Christmas Day assault, none survived. The German infantry that had accompanied the tanks found themselves trapped in open ground between burning armor and American machine guns. Some tried to surrender. Others attempted to fight their way back to German lines. The artillerymen, trained primarily to operate their guns, fought as infantry with rifles and grenades. The battle lasted roughly 30 minutes. When it ended, the snow around Hemrul was stained red, and the wreckage of what had been an elite German assault force lay scattered across the field. The 463rd suffered casualties, 3 men wounded on the gun positions on Christmas Eve, others hit during the Christmas Day battle, but the battery held. More importantly, the myth held in the balance. German soldiers who had been told Americans would not fight without coffee, who had been assured the encircled garrison would surrender once supplies ran out, who had believed that democratic soldiers lacked the stomach for real war, now stood looking at the burned shells of their finest tanks destroyed by men who had not eaten a proper meal in a week. On December 26th, the weather finally cleared enough for sustained air operations. Fighter bombers from the 19th Tactical Air Command struck German positions around Bastogne. That same afternoon, lead elements of Combat Command are from the 4th Armored Division, driving north under General George Patton's relentless urging, broke through German lines south of Bastogne. The relief force made contact with the defenders at 1,650 hours. The siege was lifted. In 8 days of encirclement, the 101st Airborne and attached units had held against overwhelming odds. They had fought without winter clothing, without adequate food, without medical supplies, without coffee. They had not merely survived, they had fought with ferocity that stunned their enemy. German casualty reports from the Bastogne sector documented losses far exceeding initial estimates. More significantly, German after-action reports and letters captured from prisoners revealed a profound psychological shift. One letter, found on the body of a German soldier from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, spoke to this transformation. The Americans are not what we were told. They fight like devils. Yesterday I saw a single American machine gun crew hold off an entire company for 3 hours. Another German officer, Major Jan Krag of the Panzer Division, captured on December 27th, told his interrogators, "You have won not because of your numbers or weapons, but because of spirit." At Bastogne, we learned that American soldiers are warriors. These were not the assessments of an enemy engaged in propaganda. These were the private admissions of soldiers who believed one thing and experienced another, who had expected softness and found steel. The symbolism was not lost on either side. Coffee, that beverage the Germans had mocked as proof of American dependence on luxury, became instead a symbol of resilience. When supplies finally reached the defenders, among the most celebrated items were the small packets of instant coffee that accompanied rations. Veterans would later recall that first cup after the siege lifted tasted better than any they had drunk before or since, not because the coffee itself was exceptional, but because of what it represented. It was not a crutch or a sign of weakness. It was a small comfort that civilized men took pleasure in, but one they had proven they could live without when survival demanded it. The Germans had tried to use coffee as evidence of American softness. The defenders of Bastogne transformed into proof of American character, men who appreciated civilization's pleasures but would endure any hardship, surrender any comfort, sacrifice anything to protect those civilizations. Private First Class Vincent Speranza provided perhaps the most telling anecdote about what the siege meant to men who lived through it. On Christmas Eve, Speranza left the aid station where he was recovering from wounds and ran through German artillery fire to a brewery in Bastogne. He filled his helmet with beer and brought it back to the wounded men in the aid station, moving from stretcher to stretcher, giving each man a sip. Decades later, the town of Bastogne would create Airborne beer in honor of the 101st, and Speranza would return as an old man to raise a glass and toast the boys who didn't come home. That gesture, running through fire to bring a moment of comfort to dying men, captured the paradox the Germans never understood. American soldiers were not soft because they valued comfort. They were strong precisely because they knew what they were fighting to preserve, a world where men could share a beer in peace, where coffee could be a morning ritual rather than an impossible luxury, where the small pleasures of life were worth dying for. The statistical record of Bastogne tells part of the story. American forces initially numbered approximately 18,000 against a German force that swelled to over 30,000. American casualties included roughly 3,000 killed, wounded, or captured. German losses were significantly higher. Estimates range from 8,000 to 12,000 casualties in the fighting around Bastogne. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion fired 7,676 rounds during the siege, an extraordinary number given that they had arrived with minimal ammunition and were resupplied only by airdrops through German fire. The defense held a perimeter 7 miles in diameter against attacks from every direction. The siege lasted 8 days. The relief came just in time. Another week, and even the defiance might not have been enough. But statistics cannot capture the transformation that occurred in those frozen December days. German military doctrine had been built on a foundation of perceived superiority, racial, cultural, ideological. The Wehrmacht had conquered most of Europe believing in its own excellence and in the weakness of democratic armies. Bastogne shattered that certainty. After the battle, German intelligence reports began to reflect a new reality. American soldiers, particularly American airborne forces, were classified as elite troops deserving of respect and caution. The casual dismissals of American fighting ability disappeared from German communication. Officers who had assured their men that Americans would break under pressure now had to explain why the broken enemy had instead broken them. This shift extended beyond military assessments into deeper questions of ideology. Nazi propaganda had long insisted that democracy produced weak men, that only authoritarian systems could forge true warriors, that comfort and freedom inevitably led to decadence and collapse. Bastogne offered a counter-narrative. The men who held that frozen perimeter were products of democracy. They were volunteers and draftees from every corner of America, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, shop clerks from New York, ranch hands from Texas. They had grown up in a society that valued individual rights, material comfort, and personal choice. They were, by Nazi definition, soft, yet when surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, frozen, starving, and bereft of even basic comforts, they had not surrendered. They had fought with savage determination that their enemy, forged in the authoritarian crucible of fascism, could not match. The answer to this paradox lay in what the Americans were fighting for. German soldiers at Bastogne fought for conquest, for preservation of a regime built on domination, for a vision of the world organized by force. American soldiers fought for the chance to go home, to return to the life they had left, to preserve a world where men could be free. That difference mattered. When McAuliffe answered nuts to the German surrender demand, he was not engaging in bravado. He was expressing the fundamental conviction of free men who had been pushed too far and would not be pushed further. When the artillerymen of the 463rd stood at their guns on Christmas morning, waiting in the darkness for enough light to kill the enemy tanks idling nearby, they were not displaying reckless courage. They were doing what had to be done to survive, to save their comrades, to hold the line. There was nothing glorious about it. It was simply necessary. The epilogue of Bastogne extends far beyond the battle itself. Today, the Martyrdom Memorial stands on a hill overlooking the town, a star-shaped monument honoring the 76,890 American soldiers killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Every December 16th, at exactly 5:30 in the morning, the moment the German offensive began, bells ring throughout Bastogne. In the town square stands a Sherman tank from the 11th Armored Division, the same model that broke through to relieve the siege. Children play on it now, climbing over armor that once meant salvation. The town's main square is named for General McAuliffe. A cafe bears the name Lou Nuts, a permanent reminder of the one-word reply that embodied American defiance. But perhaps the truest memorial exists in what did not happen. The German offensive, stalled at Bastogne and broken along the shoulders of the Bulge, never reached the Meuse River. Antwerp remained in Allied hands. The Wehrmacht exhausted its final reserves in the Ardennes and never recovered. The war in Europe ended 4 months later with Germany crushed and the forces of fascism destroyed. Had Bastogne fallen, had those 7 roads been open to German panzers, the war might have taken a different course. The men who held that frozen perimeter changed history, not through dramatic heroics, but through stubborn refusal to accept the verdict their enemy had already pronounced. In the decades after the war, many of those German officers who had predicted American collapse found themselves living in the democracy they had once dismissed as weak. Some, like those who participated in commemorations at Bastogne, spoke openly about what they had learned. One veteran, returning to Bastogne in his old age, told an interviewer, "I came here as a conqueror in 1944. I return as a friend. The Americans we fought showed us what democracy really means, not weakness but strength." That confession captures the larger truth of Bastogne. The battle was not simply a tactical victory or a strategic success. It was a definitive refutation of fascist ideology, a demonstration that free men fighting for a just cause could endure anything tyranny threw at them. The coffee, in the end, was never the point. The Germans who mocked American dependence on such comforts missed the essential truth. The ability to enjoy life's small pleasures and the will to sacrifice everything when necessary are not contradiction. They are complement. A civilization worth fighting for is one that values both the coffee and the courage to do without it. The defenders of Bastogne understood this instinctively. They had come from a nation built on the radical proposition that ordinary people, given freedom and opportunity, could build extraordinary lives. When that proposition was challenged in the frozen forests of Belgium, when they were tested by the most extreme hardships their enemy could inflict, they did not break. They held. They fought. They prevailed. 80 years later, the lesson remains. Democracy does not weaken those who live under it. Freedom does not make men soft. Abundance does not drain the will to sacrifice. These were the lies fascism told itself to justify its brutality. Bastogne exposed those lies in the most definitive way possible. When the German officers approached under their white flag on that December morning in 1944, they carried with them all the certainty of their propaganda. When they departed with McAuliffe's reply ringing in their ears, that certainty was already crumbling. In its place grew something their ideology could never have predicted: respect, then admiration, then eventually friendship. The fortress of democracy had held. The arsenal of freedom had triumphed. And in that triumph, demonstrated in blood and snow and unshakable will, the future of the free world was secured.